Welcome to Things You Don't Know, where history isn't always what you think it is, but the actual truth can be more unbelievable than any made up story.
It certainly can. And today we're telling the sticky, strange, and surprisingly deadly story of the Great Molasses Flood, an event so bizarre that many people think we're making it up.
Promise we're not. We're really not. Listen, go back here. On January 15, 1919, in Boston's North End, a wave of 2.3 million gallons of molasses tore through the city streets, killing 21 people, injuring over 150, and leveling buildings. And yes, this was done by molasses.
This is really unbelievable. It's hard for me to accept that this actually happened. It sounds like something that was said in jest rather than something that was just recorded, a real incident. How could such a thing happen like this?
It certainly did. We need to go back a ways. It's just after World War One. Boston's North End is a densely populated, working class immigrant neighborhood, predominantly Italian and Irish.
So you're saying that the neighborhood was predominantly lower class and crowded? If there was a flood of molasses, where in the world did it come from? And how was there enough fluid to actually flood the whole place?
Well, actually, it wasn't a lower class, it was lower middle class. But yeah, it was very, very crowded. And yes, how it happened. Well, there was a company called the Purity Distilling Company, and it had a gigantic storage tank near Commercial Street in that neighborhood. It stood 50 feet tall and 90 feet wide. It was a looming iron cylinder holding molasses shipped in from the Caribbean. Just to get a little bit of perspective on this, the diameter of the tank was about 1/3 of a football field. Did you get that in your head? And taller than the average telephone pole, taller than a two-story house.
That's very tall. Now, why were molasses there? Molasses are used to make industrial alcohol, which in turn was used in munitions production, and ironically, also for rum, although prohibition was just around the corner.
Well, it seems to me like they were making and probably drinking a lot of alcohol and not even paying attention to the safety issues involved.
Yeah, feels like that to me too. Here's the important part. That tank was very poorly built from the get-go, from the very start. Locals said that it groaned and leaked, and kids would scoop up molasses off the sidewalk just for fun, probably to get a little taste too. Employees, they had a solution. They painted a tank brown so you wouldn't be able to see the leaks.
Seriously, folks, that's a real detail. Paint as a cover up. I think you're right, Chandler. They were cutting serious corners to save money, and the workers probably were a little tipsy.
Then came January 15, 1919. It was unusually warm for the dead of winter, around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. After days of frigid weather, way below zero. Okay. So you have it frozen, then you have it warmed up for a couple of days. The molasses inside had expanded, and around 12:40 p.m., the tank exploded.
Eyewitnesses described the sound like a machine gun or even like thunder. One man said it was as if a giant rivet gun were being fired inside a metal drum. Bang!
The side of the tank ripped open, and in seconds, a 25-foot high wave of molasses surged outwards at 35 miles per hour. Now let that sink in. A wall of syrup, taller than a two-story house, moving faster than most people can run.
Okay, hey, Dr. Weaver, come on now. A wall of syrup? That is like something more that would happen in some kind of cartoon world. But I do understand that for the real people that actually lived through this, it was an actual disaster and not at all even humorous. Man, I'm just thinking of the surface of how the surface is going to be coated with all that syrup and how hard it would be to run away. It would also be very hard to swim in syrup. So if it caught a person, they would definitely drown.
The wave swept through Commercial Street, knocking buildings off their foundations, smashing railroad freight cars, and trapping people in their homes and in their cars and even in horse drawn wagons.
There was a police officer named Frank McManus who described seeing the molasses engulf a city block in seconds. He radioed for help, saying, "Send all available rescue vehicles and personnel. There's a wave of molasses." Well, I can only imagine that the dispatcher might have thought that this was some sort of a prank call at first, anyhow.
This was no prank, sadly. Horses were the first to die. Dozens of them were drowned or were crushed by flying debris. One firehouse was completely knocked off its foundation. Men were thrown into the lamp posts or sucked under the tide to die.
Imagine being caught in that. The molasses wasn't just sticky, it was thick and heavy, sort of like wet cement. The people who were knocked down couldn't get back up.
Oh man, I can only imagine the horror of that. I'm sure the horses were probably tied up, making it really even less likely for them to be able to escape. So when the wave of syrup hit them, they were probably helpless. And that's terrible. And I don't find that at all funny. Sounds like a real massacre in progress, in fact.
It certainly was, God help us.
Yes.
And the cold January air made it even worse. As the molasses cooled, it hardened, trapping the victims like amber. I just picture people out on the sidewalk. It must have been unbearably agonizing to watch as their friends, their customers, even their family sank into the morass to never come back.
The first rescuers on the scene were fellow Bostonians, dock workers, firemen, police, even a few nurses. They hacked through the syrup with planks and axes, trying to pull out survivors.
Oh man. The first efforts at rescue, I'm sure, would have been disorganized. It wasn't a burning building, but you know what? Who in the world would ever think of rescuing people from a condiment? The scenario wasn't covered in a manual, or it wasn't even something that people would think could even occur.
Firemen waded waist deep through the molasses. Some got stuck themselves and had to be pulled out by ropes. This is a real tragedy, friends. It took 4 days to find all the victims.
In the end, 21 people died, crushed, suffocated, or burned. Yeah, burned in the middle of winter because remember, the heat buildup and the explosion caused one layer of that molasses to be quite hot. So, just to give you a kind of a picture here, the youngest victim was only 10,
Awful.
Oh,
and more than 150 people were injured.
well, it brought a crazy aftermath, too. In addition to the toll on the horses and the property and the human life, this just sounds like an incredible mess. I just remember trying to clean up a one little simple spill of molasses. And that wasn't even easy because it's so sticky and viscous. But I can only imagine how difficult it would be to clean up this colossal mess.
Chandler, a lot of people wouldn't know that you would have any contact with the molasses, but hey, I'm a Southern boy too, and I know that molasses is kind of a staple of the cooking arts. I'm sorry to interrupt you there, Dr. Deneen, but I just had to add that in.
But you are right though, Dr. Weaver. I appreciate you adding that because like with my mama and everybody, my grandmother. I mean, I've had hands and known about molasses and dealt with it ever since I was like, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 years old.
Of course.
Thank you both for relating that. The tragedy is the cleanup took months. Crews hosed down the streets with salt water from Boston Harbor. Dozens of pairs of horseshoes and boots were ruined, and then trains tracked the sticky residue all across New England.
And the smell. According to accounts, the area reeked of molasses for decades. Some said you could smell it on hot days into the 1960s. I've been to Boston. I didn't really smell it, but I wasn't in that particular district. I was more in the district where Harvard is.
Yeah, I've been there also. I did not smell it, but I heard about it even then. Now, the Purity Distilling Company, which was owned by United States Industrial Alcohol, quickly tried to put a political spin on things and blame anarchists for the sabotage. They were the universal villains at that time, like terrorists are today or communists during the Cold War. They were the common scapegoat at that time.
Or fake news. Yeah, yeah,
Oh yeah.
yeah. We've covered the chaos of the Great Molasses Flood, buildings crushed, people trapped. But what about other kinds of health effects? The molasses may have stopped moving, but the suffering did not.
You're absolutely right, Dr. Weaver. From what I've heard, the aftermath was almost as horrifying as the flood itself. The streets were slick for weeks. Crews tried to hose the molasses into the harbor, but it just kept clinging, both literally and metaphorically.
And medically, it was just a big old disaster zone. The hot molasses caused burns. Some victims even drowned. Others were crushed, and those who inhaled the fumes or got the sticky substance in their wounds were at risk of infections, some of which were very serious and even dire.
Let's break it down. First, the injuries. This wasn't just sticky, it was deadly. What kinds of physical trauma did victims suffer, Chandler?
Oh, Dr. Weaver, plenty, man. They had broken ribs, crushed limbs, deep lacerations from debris. Heck, man, one man was even so bad, his breath was even so compressed that his rescuer said that last breath even made a bubbling sound. The molasses was hot enough to scald exposed skin, and when it cooled, it hardened around people just like concrete.
And it didn't just trap people, it also trapped rescue workers. Many of them got stuck or collapsed from exhaustion trying to wade through syrup that was waist high. There were even reports of rescuers vomiting from the sickeningly sweet smell.
I wonder, can you review some of the long-term health effects?
Oh yeah, infections were a considerable problem. Several people developed gangrene after exposure, skin rashes, respiratory issues, particularly among the elderly and the very young, were quite common. Among the sugar-rich environment became a breeding ground for bacteria.
Now, when you said gangrene, got any idea why the gangrene would be precipitated by all that molasses? It's a real simple equation. Gangrene,
Sugar content, right?
yes, and it also has other plant elements. And we all think about plant elements as being so healthy for you. Well, that's true. But guess what? If you paint yourself in that kind of stuff, what happens is every little germ, every little piece of bacteria just goes, "Ooh, goody, here's something I can eat right away." And when that happens, you can get gangrene. Gangrene is nothing to snub at. It is serious.
Yes, it is. And too much of anything is not good for you either.
That's correct. Well, could you have anything to say, Dr. Deneen?
Yeah, that's very important. We don't forget that. People were permanently affected by this. Children had nightmares. Many people refused to walk near the flood site. One woman described the scent of molasses triggering panic attacks in her for decades afterwards. We'd probably call it PTSD today.
That's really haunting. And PTSD can affect so many
Oh,
aspects
yes,
of
it
your
can.
life. But I'm wondering, Chandler, you got any information for us about environmental effects here?
Oh, yeah. You better believe the environment got a piece of it too. Molasses seeped into the harbor, turning it brown for months. The fish died, the rats multiplied, and the city had to increase the chlorine in the nearby water systems just to combat bacteria blooms. It also led to the introduction of new regulations for industrial storage tanks.
Exactly. This was the tail end of what was called a progressive era, a time of great reforms. So the Boston Building Department started requiring regular inspections and better tank construction. The Purity Distilling Company, for example, faced nearly 120 lawsuits. It was one of the earliest examples of demonstrating corporate accountability in U.S. disaster law.
So, not to interrupt, but I guess that there were some maybe good advancements that came out of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Just having some safety regs in place. The Great Molasses Flood wasn't just a freak accident. It did leave scars, physical, emotional, environmental, and as you allude to, Chandler, it spurred change. You know, let's examine the lawsuits a little bit, just for fun, and see how this flood reshaped liability laws in America. Okay, we did mention a class action lawsuit was filed, and that was one of the first major civil lawsuits against a corporation in American history. It lasted 5 years to try it.
I'm sure the company did everything they could to dodge, but in the end, USIA was found liable. They were forced to pay out $628,000. And mind you, this is 1924. That's $10 million dollars in today's money in punitive damages. This is over and above medical expenses and the destruction of property. This was a landmark victory for the victims of industrial negligence.
So, how come they got slapped so hard? Why did the tank fail? Investigators later found that it had been built too thin, with poor steel quality, insufficient rivets, and no pressure testing before it was filled. And you got some more information about that, Dr. Deneen. I know.
Yes, I think there was a desire to punish the slapdash way that this tank had been put up. And then something else happened. Just days before the disaster, the company had pumped in a fresh load of warm molasses on the top of the cold molasses. And remember, we talked about the weather going back and forth from very cold to warmer temperatures. And the fermentation likely built up carbon dioxide, adding to the pressure inside.
In other words, just to summarize, bad engineering plus corporate corner cutting plus chemistry plus heat equals disaster.
That equation scares me.
Me too. To its credit, the state of Massachusetts rigorously enforced the rules in the future. So the Great Molasses Flood led to changes in building safety laws, first in Massachusetts and later on throughout the rest of the country. After 1919, engineers had to file stamped blueprints. That meant they'd been gone over by two inspectors, submit them to frequent inspections, and demonstrate before any use that their structures had been stress tested.
As is often the case, it sort of became a folk legend, often cited alongside other notable phenomena, but things like exploding whales and raining frogs. Now, raining frogs, I know that has happened for sure, but this isn't a joke. It was a preventable tragedy that revealed how lax oversight could kill. That's one reason I am very concerned about the current government administration and their desire to relax oversight and safety regulations. I can only hope that if there is another disaster, well, that they get to sample some of the tragedy up close and personal themselves.
I went to Massachusetts in 1990 when I tried out for Jeopardy when I was in high school, and I was told by an elderly cab driver that this story was taught to Boston school children as being an early version of some of the disasters that happened in the nuclear industry, like Three Mile Island and Chernobyl.
Well, I mean, it is as serious. I mean, it's not bombs, and it might be a matter of something that you dip your chicken in and that you put in your cookie, but it still caused some serious, vile damage.
Absolutely, and strictly from a historical point of view, it's also a very powerful living example of how history can hide in plain sight. If you walk through Boston's North End today, you won't see that tank, it's long gone. But there is a plaque where it stood.
You know, I want to challenge our listeners to something here. I want you to ask 10 people, just random people, it could be people you know, people you don't know. Just ask 10 people if they've even ever heard of this. And I am willing to bet you that the majority will say, "What? No, of course not. That's silly," or something to that effect.
Well, as a matter of fact, Dr. Weaver, I have already asked three people today, one of them being my love, and they all think I'm making it up. They all think that I'm making it up.
I have a surprise both for you, Dr. Deneen, and Chandler, too, and our listeners. I've got some pictures of it, photographs.
Oh,
Wow.
that's neat.
Yeah. So, anyhow, according to some locals, on hot summer days, you can still catch a whiff of the molasses. As we close here, history isn't just kings, wars, and revolutions, names, dates, battles, da da da. It's not. Sometimes it's a syrup tank bursting in the sun.
Yes, it is. And sometimes it's even said often that the reason to learn history is that history repeats itself. And truly seeing what is happening is a truly crucial responsibility of the people.
I couldn't agree more. On a slightly lighter note, the very first time I ever heard of this story was in a very relaxed setting. It's one of the inspirations for a location in the children's game Candyland called Molasses
Ah,
Mountain.
that's where that came from.
I read that when I was a young boy, and I thought, how could something so horrible turn into something that I loved so much in my childhood? But that's the way things turn out. On a slightly personal note, if I may, before we pack it in for tonight, many of you will remember some of our Revolutionary War podcasts on Caesar Drake, Harry Washington, Betsy Frazee, and so on. Well, I'm very pleased to tell you I'm going to exercise a little privilege and brag on myself a little bit that I've just been asked to be the Grand Marshal of the Union County Yorktown March Parade this August, commemorating for next year the 250th anniversary of American independence. So I'm going to try to get some of the people involved in this, the Washington Rochambeau group that I belong to maybe appear on a podcast or talk to us because our country wouldn't exist without those brave patriots, black and white alike. And I'm thrilled to play a small part in remembering.
Yeah, congratulations on that, Dr. Deneen.
Thank
Indeed,
you, Chandler.
indeed. Okay. Well, look, thanks for joining us on Things You Don't Know. Want you to hurry right on back.
Yeah, hurry right on back. You don't want to be so slow as molasses.
All right.
That's true. So if you liked today's episode, leave a comment, share the story, a suggestion for other topics, and share the story, as I said, before it gets lost under the weight of time or even the weight of molasses. Thank you, friends.
Ta ta.
Bye for now.